The trailer sat in a field near Chalmette, Louisiana, autumn 2005. Its windows fogged from the inside, not from breath or steam, but from the slow exhalation of the walls themselves. The families inside had lost everything in a hurricane. The government gave them a temporary shelter built from bonded wood chips and resin. The same chemistry that preserves dead tissue in anatomy jars was now being breathed by children sleeping on metal bunks. The nosebleeds started within weeks. The burning throats, the headaches that never lifted. The molecule had been declared a known human carcinogen in 2004, but the trailers had already been shipped. This is not a story about a natural disaster. It is about the second disaster, nested inside the first, a promise of safety that became a delivery system for a poison. The house kept breathing long after the floodwaters receded. This is the deep archive. We leave the surface now, the press rooms, the committee hearings, the sealed recall documents, and descend into the evidence. Below, a formalin jar holding a century-old hand, a plywood press at dawn, a FEMA inspection clipboard curling in humidity. A child's bedroom where the air measures the cost of cheap shelter. The hatch seals, the archive opens, and the story begins where the windows closed. The first man to notice it was not looking for a preservative. He was looking for a clean decomposition, a way to break one substance into simpler pieces, and the sharpness in the air was simply an irritation, an unwanted byproduct of an experiment that refused to behave. In 1855, Alexander Butlerov, a Russian chemist with the careful beard and tired eyes of someone who spent too many hours bending over glassware, heated methylene acetate and watched it fall apart. What rose from the flask was not what he expected. It was a colorless vapor that bit the inside of his nose before he could lean away, a sensation he logged in his notebook with the same clinical restraint he used for everything else. The entry was brief. The vapor was noted. The experiment was set aside. What Butlerov had stumbled into was formaldehyde, though he did not name it and did not pursue it. The molecule entered the historical record as a footnote, a chemical curiosity with an unpleasant disposition and no obvious use. It sat there for more than a decade, waiting for someone who needed exactly what it offered, though nobody yet knew what that was. The someone arrived in the form of August Wilhelm von Hofmann, a German chemist whose career was a catalog of patient, methodical refinements. Where Butlerov had accidentally produced a small, irritating cloud, Hofmann saw a challenge of control. In the 1860s, he devised a reliable synthesis, a stream of methanol vapor mixed with air, passed over a heated platinum spiral. The platinum glowed. The methanol surrendered its structure. And out the other side came a colorless gas that Hofmann, with a gift for understatement, described as possessing a peculiarly penetrating, suffocating odor. He had tamed the reaction, bottled the irritant, and given chemistry a new tool. The molecule's career had begun. It is easy now to imagine formaldehyde arriving in the world already dressed for its later role, as the embalmer's agent, the anatomist's quiet partner, the liquid that would fill 1 million glass jars with suspended, teachable flesh. But in the 1860s, nobody was thinking about cadavers. The chemical was simply a new entry in the growing catalog of organic synthesis, a demonstration that methanol could be transformed into something sharper, more reactive, more useful. Its pungency was a footnote to its structure, not a promise. The promise revealed itself slowly. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, formaldehyde found work as a disinfectant, its very hostility to human membranes repurposed as a weapon against the microscopic life that spoiled food. infected wounds, and rotted surgical linen. Misting solutions of the diluted gas through hospital wards became a ritual of modern sanitation, a chemical scrubbing of air that could not be seen. And somewhere in that practical application, a suggestion took root. If this substance could arrest decay in a hospital room, could it do the same for human tissue? The question was not theoretical. Medical schools in Europe and America were expanding rapidly, and their appetite for anatomical specimens had begun to outstrip the traditional supply of fresh corpses, a supply that had always depended on an uneasy traffic between execution yards, poorhouses, and the nighttime activities of men with shovels and discretion. Cadavers rotted quickly. Alcohol preserved them imperfectly, hardening tissue into something more like leather than living flesh. Arsenic-based preparations slowed decay, but poisoned the very students who handled them. A slow accounting of tingling fingers, gastrointestinal distress, and the accumulating shadow of a classroom hazard that nobody wanted to name aloud. Formalin, a dilute solution of formaldehyde gas in water, arrived in the anatomy theaters of the 1890s, not as an innovation but as a deliverance. It cross-linked the proteins of dead flesh, locking cellular architecture into a permanent embrace, halting the soft collapse of membranes and the slow liquefaction of organs that had always defined the boundary between a specimen and a corpse. A body preserved in formalin did not rot. It did not smell of putrefaction. It held its shape, its color, its internal geography, so perfectly that a student could return to the same dissected hand months later and find the nerves still waiting, the tendons still distinct, the lessons still intact. The cost was the same acrid sharpness that Butlerov had noticed in 1855. Anatomy theaters filled with the prickling vapor of formalin. Students wept at their dissecting tables, not from emotion but from the chemical assault on their conjunctivae. The air itself became a mild injury, a constant negotiation between the need to see and the body's desire to retreat. Windows were opened when weather permitted. In winter, the cold mixed with the sharpness, and students learned to blink less and work faster. But the specimens endured. The jars filled up, and the peculiar contract was signed, a substance that announced itself through violent sensation, sharp to the nose, prickling to the eye, unmistakably hostile to living tissue, became civilization's preferred means of holding the dead still against time. It is worth pausing on the jar. Not the body inside it, but the jar itself. Thick glass, a ground glass stopper, a handwritten label in fading ink. Inside, suspended in liquid the color of weak tea, a human hand or cross-section of kidney floats with a stillness that never belonged to living tissue. The stillness of sleep is different. There is always a residual tension, a preparedness to wake. The stillness of formalin is absolute. The proteins have been locked into a new arrangement, a chemical armistice between dissolution and display. The tissue is not alive, but it is not exactly gone either. It has been interrupted. This was the gift that the late Victorian world received from an irritating vapor nobody had asked for. Anatomy became a discipline of clarity, no longer dependent on the hurried dissection of softening flesh. Medical illustration flourished. For the first time, an artist could work from a specimen that looked the same on Wednesday as it had on Monday. The cold cathedrals of suspended decay, as the anatomy theaters came to be, filled with the quiet light of gas lamps catching the smooth surface of hundreds of jars, their contents cataloged and numbered and available to any student who needed to trace a nerve pathway or a vascular tree. What nobody asked, because the question did not yet make sense, was what else this molecule might do once it left the jar. The preservative had proven itself too useful to remain in the anatomy theater forever. It had learned to halt the soft processes of biology. It had demonstrated an uncanny ability to infiltrate organic matter and change its relationship to time. And it was, in its pure form, a colorless gas, invisible, pervasive, impossible to lock out of a room once it had begun to seep from whatever container held it. The strange part was not that formaldehyde preserved bodies. The strange part was that anyone assumed it would stop there. The molecule had no loyalty to the dead. It would, in time, enter the walls of the living. It would drift from plywood adhesives and insulation foams. It would become the faint sweetness in a new car, the background note in a freshly furnished nursery, the invisible exhalation of the modern interior. It would preserve nothing. It would simply be breathed. But that was still decades away. For now, at the close of the 19th century, there was only the dissecting room at night, the faint yellow light, the ranked jars, the air thick with a sharpness that students had learned to ignore. The specimens floated in their formalin baths, silent and complete. The preservative had done its work. And somewhere in the stillness, the first trace of an agreement that nobody remembered signing settled into the air, a molecule that would keep its side of the bargain long after anyone had stopped asking what the bargain was. The air at dawn has a weight of its own. Inside the plywood mill, that weight is doubled. Steam from the hot presses hangs low and white, carrying the sweet, sharp scent of curing resin, a smell that catches in the back of the throat like the memory of a varnish shop. The conveyors rattle, feeding veneer sheets into the maw of the press where heat and pressure force them together with something invisible, a molecule that will hold them fast for decades, long after the factory is gone. That molecule is formaldehyde. And in the early 20th century, it was about to become the quietest laborer in the modern home. Before the plywood mill, before the particleboard, before the adhesive that turned wood scraps into furniture, formaldehyde had already proven its usefulness in a more austere setting. In 1907, a Belgian-born chemist named Leo Baekeland filed a patent for something he called Bakelite, the first fully synthetic plastic made by reacting phenol with formaldehyde under heat and pressure. The result was a material that did not soften when heated, did not dissolve in common solvents, and could be molded into shapes that held their form with the rigidity of a cast iron skillet. It was a triumph of applied chemistry, and it demonstrated something that the earlier anatomical uses had only hinted at. Formaldehyde did not just stop decay in dead tissue. It could lock molecules into new, permanent arrangements. It could build. Baekeland's invention opened a door. If formaldehyde could cross-link phenol into a hard, durable plastic, what else could it bind? The chemical industry began experimenting with other partners, urea, melamine, resorcinol, and found that the same reaction that halted protein decomposition could glue wood fibers together into sheets stronger than natural timber. The timber industry, which had long relied on animal glues that softened in humidity and invited rot, saw an opportunity. By the 1930s, urea formaldehyde and phenol formaldehyde adhesives were entering commercial production, and the economics of wood were about to change. The strange part was not that the adhesives worked, but that they worked so cheaply. A tree trunk, once milled into lumber, yields only a fraction of its volume as usable boards. The rest becomes slabs, chips, sawdust, low-value waste. Urea formaldehyde resin changed that calculation. You could take those chips and fragments, mix them with the clear, syrupy glue, press them under heat, and produce a board that was flat, uniform, and structurally reliable. It could be cut, sanded, painted, and shipped across the country. It cost less than solid wood because it used less of the tree, and it could be manufactured in immense quantities from a chemical that was itself cheap to produce. Formaldehyde, after all, was made from methanol, which came from natural gas or coal, both abundant in the industrializing world. The plywood factory at dawn was a place where transformation happened, not through craftsmanship, but through chemistry. The steam, the resin, the roll of veneer sheets, and the press closing with a hydraulic sigh. Workers in overalls would arrive with the stitching of the adhesive already sharp in the air, a smell that clung to fabric and skin, a smell that would follow them home. Nobody thought of it as dangerous. It smelled like progress. By the mid-1940s, the building industry had integrated these composites into nearly every surface. Suburban housing boomed after the Second World War, and the materials that made those houses cheap and quick, plywood sheathing, particleboard subfloors, medium-density fiberboard cabinetry, plastic laminate countertops, all relied on formaldehyde-based adhesives. The molecule had moved from the morgue into the living room without anyone asking permission. It was in the walls, the floors, the cabinets, the hollow core doors, the pegboard in the garage, the back of the bookcase, the underside of the kitchen table. The irony was structured into the architecture. The same chemical that held dead tissue in suspended stillness now held the fragments of a tree into a flat panel that would stand upright for decades. The preservation of one kind of death, the cellular breakdown of a human body, had been repurposed into the preservation of another kind of death, the chopped, pulped, reconstituted remains of a forest. The house itself became a kind of embalming, a slowing of decay, a structure built to resist time. By arresting the natural rot of wood with a resin that would not yield to moisture or insects. But that resin was never entirely still. It cured, yes, formed long polymer chains that locked the formaldehyde molecules into place, but the reaction was never perfect. Some fraction of the formaldehyde remained unbound, a fugitive molecule trapped inside the cured glue, waiting for warmth, humidity, or the simple passage of years to release it into the air. Off-gassing was not a defect, it was a feature of the chemistry, a necessary incompleteness. The glue had to breathe a little so that the board could stay solid. The implications of that small imperfection would not register for decades. In the 1950s and 1960s, the smell of a new house was the smell of fresh paint, new carpet, and that faintly sweet, slightly sharp undertone of pressed wood. It was marketed as cleanliness, as newness, as the aroma of a life freshly begun. Advertisements for mobile homes, which used even higher concentrations of particleboard in their thin-walled construction, spoke of affordability and freedom. Nobody mentioned the molecule that made it possible. Nobody needed to. The house was not supposed to have a memory of its own making. The plant had no politics, but its bark acquired an empire. The tree had not chosen to be shredded and glued. The molecule had not chosen to be in the glue. But the choices made in laboratories and boardrooms during the first half of the 20th century had laminated themselves into the physical envelope of modern life. By the time suburbia reached its peak, formaldehyde was no longer a reagent in a glass flask. It was the hidden skeleton of 1,000 suburban streets, a silent partner in the mortgage, an invisible line item in the cost of shelter. At night, in a new house, with the windows closed against the cold, the air would grow still. The resin in the walls would continue its slow exhalation, a process measured not in seconds but in years. The occupants would breathe it, unnoticed, as they slept. The shelf of a new bookcase, the back of a new desk, the interior of a new cabinet. Each one was a quiet archive of the factory dawn where steam rose and conveyors rattled, and a man in overalls wiped his forehead with a sleeve that smelled faintly of something clinical and sweet. That smell was the molecule of many hands, the chemist who first refined it, the entrepreneur who built the plant, the worker who fed the press, the salesman who sold the board, the carpenter who cut it, the family who lived inside the box it made. Each hand added a layer of intention and ignorance. Each one contributed to a structure that would stand for years, slowly releasing its own biography into the lungs of those who trusted its stillness. The house was not a villain. It was a product. But a product, once assembled, does not stop acting. It remembers its making in the only language it has, the chemistry of its composition. And that chemistry, as the 20th century wore on, would begin to speak more clearly than anyone had intended. The house was built to keep the cold out. That was the idea anyway. After the oil embargoes of the 1970s, after the lines at the pumps and the thermostats turned down to shivering, the architects and the code writers made a collective decision: seal the envelope, weather stripping, double glazing, vapor barriers, caulk guns in every contractor's hand. The logic was impeccable. If you cannot afford to heat the outdoors, do not let the outdoors in. The unintended consequence took a decade to register because it had no taste, no visible color, no weight on the scales. It was simply a change in the chemistry of ordinary air. Before the seals, a house breathed. The gaps around windows, the cracks in the foundation, the chimney drafts, the loose fit of wooden doors, all of it exchanged the interior with the exterior, slow but constant, like a tide moving through gravel. A building was not a container, it was a sieve. After the insulation crews finished, after the storms and the thresholds were compressed into rubber gaskets, the same volume of air stayed put. Anything released inside that volume had nowhere to go. It accumulated, it circulated. It settled into the upholstery and the carpet, fibers, and the soft tissue of the lungs. The materials that filled these new, airtight rooms had been designed for utility, not for breath. Plywood, particleboard, medium-density fiberboard, each one a composite of wood fragments bonded with resins whose chemistry came directly from the 19th century dissecting room. Urea formaldehyde, phenol formaldehyde. The same cross-linking reactions that locked proteins into eternal stillness now locked wood chips into cheap, smooth panels. The panels went into kitchen cabinets, bedroom furniture, wall sheathing, subflooring. They went into the mobile home industry with particular enthusiasm because pressed wood is lightweight and strong and can be cut to fit any frame. And in a mobile home, where every inch is accounted for and the walls are thin and the windows are few, the ratio of resin to air becomes something the architects never calculated. Consider the new car smell. For decades, it was marketed as a luxury, a sign of fresh prosperity, the olfactory equivalent of a showroom smile. Automobile magazines praised it, buyers inhaled it. Then the chemists took samples. What they found was a volatile cocktail, phthalates, benzene, toluene, and formaldehyde as the steady base note. The smell was not freshness. It was the off-gassing of adhesives, plasticizers, synthetic textiles, and foam cushioning, all heated by the sun through a glass capsule and recirculated by the ventilation system. Luxury was a warm metal box full of curing resin. Prosperity was measured by the concentration of molecules that, in any other context, belonged to the embalmer's table. The strangest part was that people began to associate the odor with safety. A new house smelled that way because it was new. A new trailer smelled that way because it was clean. The nose adapted quickly. The sweet, sharp note faded from conscious perception within weeks, but the emission did not stop. It tapered slowly over years. The body never fully adapted. The eyes still burned. The throat still felt raw on humid summer nights when the trailer's windows were sealed against mosquitoes and the air conditioner recycled the same 500 cubic feet of air until it tasted like the inside of a specimen jar. In 1976, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development began testing formaldehyde levels in mobile homes for the first time. The results were not published broadly. They showed that indoor concentrations could reach 2.5 parts per million or higher, 10 to 100 times the outdoor ambient level. At those concentrations, the compound that preserves dead tissue begins to irritate living tissue. The eyes water, the nose runs, the chest tightens. Children in trailers developed nosebleeds that came and went without explanation. The symptoms were real, but they were also diffuse, easy to attribute to pollen or dust, or the general misery of a hot climate. The chemical itself was invisible. It had no agenda. It simply obeyed the laws of vapor pressure, moving from the glue inside the wallboard into the air of the bedroom, waiting for the next breath. Consider now a specific bedroom. Suburban. Summer night. The window is shut. The air conditioner hums. A child sits at a new desk, laminated pressed wood, dark finish, smooth edges. The desk was a gift, a sign that the family had moved up, that the house was becoming a home. The child presses a nose to the surface idly, the way children do. The smell is faintly sweet, faintly clinical, not quite wood and not quite plastic, but something in between, a scent that belongs to laboratories and furniture showrooms equally. The child breathes it in. The lungs are small. The air is still. The desk will continue to exhale its resin for months, years, gradually slowing, never stopping entirely. No one will measure the parts per million in this room. No one will file a report. The body will manage the exposure, the way it manages all background poisons, by metabolizing some, tolerating others, and storing the rest in cells that may or may not remember the insult decades later. That is the interior that the 1970s built. A sealed room full of modern conveniences, each one bonded with a molecule that began its career in anatomy halls. The irony was not that the chemical was dangerous. Most things are dangerous in the wrong dose. The irony was that people paid extra for the sealed quiet, for the tight windows, for the new car fragrance that came standard with the upholstery. They traded ventilation for efficiency and called it progress. The measurement of that bargain would not be visible for another generation. It would appear in epidemiology papers and class action lawsuits, and the quiet medical records of families who lived in trailers after a hurricane. But that is a story that comes later. For now, the desk is new. The air is still. The child breathes. And the house that kept breathing poison did not grow lungs. It grew carpets, cabinets, countertops, and 1,000 tiny sources of the same vapor, all of them waiting for the windows to close. The trailer sat in a field near Chalmette, Louisiana, in the autumn of 2005. Its white metal skin had already begun to dull under the Gulf sun, and the windows were fogged from the inside, not with steam from cooking or breath, but with the slow exhalation of the walls themselves. A clipboard hung from the front door handle, its paper curling in the humidity. The numbers written there would later be read aloud in a congressional hearing, but the people who lived inside had already recorded their own data: burning throats, bloody noses, the kind of headache that begins behind the eyes and stays for weeks. The trailer was a temporary shelter after a natural disaster. It became a second disaster nested inside the first, and the molecule responsible was the same one that had been holding corpses still for more than a century. Formaldehyde had spent 100 years learning to work invisibly. By the early 21st century, it was no longer just the sharp smell in anatomy rooms or the faint sting of a pathology lab. It had become a structural thread in the fabric of modern life, pressed into particleboard, bonded into plywood, woven into synthetic fabrics, and sealed inside the glue that held trailers together. The same chemistry that locked proteins in place for dissection now locked the walls of temporary housing into rigid, lightweight panels. The same gas that preserved dead tissue in glass jars was now being breathed by families who had lost everything and been given a box of bonded wood chips to sleep in. The International Agency for Research on Cancer had been watching formaldehyde for decades. In 2004, after reviewing a body of evidence that included occupational studies of embalmers, industrial workers, and anatomists, the agency elevated the molecule from a probable carcinogen, group 2 amps, to a known human carcinogen, group 1. The decision was not dramatic. It was the conclusion of a long, slow accumulation of data, death certificates, tissue samples, years of follow-up with men and women who had spent their careers breathing low concentrations of a gas that pricks the nose and stings the eyes. The link was strongest for nasopharyngeal cancer, a rare malignancy of the upper throat, but the evidence also pointed toward myeloid leukemia, a cancer of the bone marrow and blood. In 2009, the IARC confirmed that second association more firmly. The molecule that stops decay was now officially understood as something that could start it. But the official classification did not land with the weight of a verdict. It arrived as a committee statement, a summary of relative risk, a line in a report that would be read by regulators and industry lawyers, and then filed. The homes that contained formaldehyde did not vanish. The trailers that had been issued by FEMA after Hurricane Katrina were still standing, and inside them the concentration of formaldehyde was measured at levels that sometimes exceeded the occupational limits set for factories. The agency had been warned by its own experts that the temporary housing units might off-gas at alarming rates, but the warnings were buried in procurement paperwork, and the trailers were shipped anyway. By the time the first residents began complaining of burning eyes and nosebleeds, the units had already been occupied for weeks. The strange thing was not that formaldehyde caused damage at high doses. That had been known for nearly a century. The strange thing was the shape of the damage when the doses were low and the exposure was long. In factories, where workers handled formaldehyde solutions or breathed vapors from industrial presses, the risk was acknowledged. Masks were worn. Ventilation was installed. The danger was labeled. But in the FEMA trailer, in the suburban bedroom with the new plywood flooring, In the office cubicle with the particleboard desk and the pressed wood bookshelves, there was no label, there was no mask. There was only the gentle, continuous release of a molecule that had been built into the materials of everyday life. The walls were not breathing poison in the way a chemical spill breathes poison. They were breathing it the way a drawer of dried lavender breathes scent, slowly, patiently, and without any visible sign of violence. The medical examiners who studied the trailers in the aftermath of Katrina found something that had already been described in the occupational literature, but had never been so plainly observed in a residential setting. The risk was not a single acute dose. It was the accumulated weight of years. A child sleeping in a room with urea formaldehyde insulation might breathe the molecule for 8 hours a night, 300 nights a year, from the age of 5 to the age of 18. An office worker sitting in a sealed cubicle with laminate flooring might inhale the same gas for 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year, for a decade or more. The body's detoxification enzymes, aldehyde dehydrogenases, could handle a certain load, but the system had limits. When the load exceeded the capacity, the molecule began to form crosslinks with proteins and DNA, creating the kind of cellular damage that can, over time, become the seed of a malignancy. The FEMA trailers became a symbol of this invisible failure. The numbers on the inspection clipboards told a story that the residents had already told with their bodies. The indoor air contained formaldehyde at concentrations up to 20 times the recommended limit in some units. The federal government eventually acknowledged the problem, moved families into hotels, and began buying back the trailers. But the trailers themselves did not vanish. They were sold at auction, sometimes to private owners who did not know what the clipboards had recorded. They went to construction sites, to hunting camps, to the backyards of people who needed cheap storage. The poison did not stop when the inspection ended. It only changed address. The paradox of formaldehyde is that its danger was most plain not in the places where people expected to find danger, not in the factory, not in the morgue, not in the chemistry lab with its fume hoods and warning signs, but in the places where people felt safest. The soft sofa upholstered with synthetic fibers, the shiny kitchen cabinet made of medium-density fiberboard, the new car with its sealed windows and its fragrance of manufactured freshness, the temporary trailer provided by a government agency after a hurricane. These were not settings where one expects to be slowly poisoned. They were the backdrop of ordinary life, the material envelope of domestic comfort. And yet the same molecule that preserved the dead was present in the air, day after day, year after year, in concentrations too low to smell, but high enough to matter over time. The slow dialectic of damage, the conversation between dose and duration, between the body's capacity to repair and the molecule's capacity to accumulate, was not a new idea. It had been understood since the early days of occupational medicine, but it had never been so clearly demonstrated in the homes of ordinary civilians. The trailers were a kind of accidental experiment, a naturalistic study in which thousands of people were exposed to a known carcinogen without their knowledge or consent. The data that emerged from that experiment confirmed what the IARC had already determined, that formaldehyde is not a poison that kills quickly, but a poison that waits. It does not announce itself with a bang or a scream. It announces itself with a nosebleed that seems trivial, a headache that passes, a cough that becomes chronic, and then, years later, a diagnosis that nobody connects to the trailer or the desk or the laminate floor. The trailer in the Louisiana field was eventually towed away. The dust from the parking lot settled. The clipboard was removed, filed, and forgotten. But the molecule that had filled its interior did not disappear. It went into the bodies of the people who had breathed it, and there, in the cellular archive of living tissue, it left its signature. The archive exhales slowly. The listener, wherever they are, breathes it in. The story does not end with a door slamming shut. It ends with the window fogging over, the numbers on the clipboard fading in the humidity, and the quiet persistence of a chemistry that does not care whether it is preserving or destroying, only that it works. The fluorescent light in the committee room does not hum. It flickers at a frequency just below conscious perception, a subtle mismatch between the eye and the brain. On the gray table, stacks of toxicological reports rise in neat columns, each page dense with hazard ratios, confidence intervals, and the careful language of probabilistic harm. A single drop of condensation slides down a water glass, slow enough to watch, slow enough to time. The lawyer for the composites industry adjusts his spectacles and begins reading a prepared statement into the official record. His voice is calm, technical, unhurried. It could be a lecture on polymer chemistry. He does not mention the trailers. He does not mention the schools. He speaks, instead of best available science, of exposure thresholds that have not been exceeded, of compliance rates that exceed 99%. The microphone picks up the rustle of paper. The drop of water reaches the tabletop and is absorbed by a coaster. This is how regulation happens, not in a moment of moral clarity, but in a room where the air is still and the clock on the wall is synchronized to the nearest second. The United States does not have a single federal law governing the air you breathe inside your own home. It never did. Instead, the responsibility for formaldehyde has been fractured across agencies like a mirror dropped on a stone floor. The Environmental Protection Agency sets limits for composite wood products under the Formaldehyde Standards Act of 2010, a law that took decades to pass and was already outdated by the time it was signed. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration maintains workplace ceilings for factories and embalming rooms, but those limits apply only to employees, not to the families sleeping in the houses built from the boards those factories produced. The Consumer Product Safety Commission can issue recalls for hazardous goods, but it cannot test every laminate floor, every piece of particleboard furniture, every roll of synthetic carpet that arrives at a port of entry. No single agency owns the problem. No single agency can. The strange part is not that the system has gaps. The strange part is that the system was designed with gaps, and then industry learned to navigate them the way water learns to find the cracks in a hole. When one state, California, introduced strict Phase 2 limits for formaldehyde emissions in composite wood in 2008, manufacturers adjusted their supply chains, blending more low-emitting resin for the California market and shipping higher-emitting boards to states with weaker enforcement. The molecule did not disappear. It simply moved, following the path of least resistance, same as always. The European Union's REACH legislation, adopted in 2007, formally classifies formaldehyde as a carcinogen and restricts its concentration in consumer articles. But compliance depends on testing regimes that must chase a moving target, new proprietary resin blends, imported goods from countries with different regulatory cultures, products that are assembled at one facility, coated at another, and sold across borders that exist only on maps. Every time a standard is set, the industry develops a resin formula that meets it, just barely, while the chemistry of off-gassing remains unchanged. The formaldehyde does not care about the paperwork. It only cares about temperature, humidity, and time. Public attention peaks after high-profile episodes, and those episodes have their own rhythm. There was the outbreak of sick school syndrome in the 1990s, when teachers in portable classrooms complained of burning eyes, sore throats, and nosebleeds. Investigators found formaldehyde levels inside the mobile units that exceeded outdoor air by a factor of 20, sometimes 50. The schools were closed, the media moved on, and the portable classrooms were sold to other districts at a discount. There was the laminate flooring recall of 2015, when a major Chinese manufacturer was found to be shipping boards that off-gassed formaldehyde far above the legal limit. Homeowners ripped out their floors, filed class action lawsuits, and received compensation that covered the cost of replacement, but not the years of exposure that had already occurred. There was the celebrity-backed detox narrative, the influencer with the air quality monitor, the viral video of a sealant applied to a nursery wall. Each episode rises, burns bright, and recedes. The chronic low-level exposure does not make headlines. It does not have a single name. It does not have a patient zero. It has only the slow, cumulative weight of years spent breathing the background. The rhythm of public forgetfulness recapitulates formaldehyde's own chemistry. The molecule is volatile. It evaporates quickly, degrades in sunlight, dissipates when a window is opened. It is hard to hold, quick to fade from conscious memory, but it is also continuously replenished. The plywood panel in the bedroom does not stop off-gassing after a year. The rate decreases, but it does not stop. The pressboard desk in the corner, the laminated bookshelf, the engineered floor that replaced the carpet, they all continue to emit at a lower, steadier rate, a slow exhalation that the body absorbs without permission. Regulation arrives after the fact. Each rule comes after the next bonded layer has been installed, after the new house warranty has expired, after trust has quietly settled into symptom. The committee room where the lawyer reads his rebuttal is not an exception. It is the rule. Toxicology reports are written in ink. Commerce moves in glue. There is a small irony in the language of oversight. The word regulate comes from the Latin regula, a straight piece of wood, a ruler, a guide. In carpentry, a straight piece of wood ensures that the cut is true. In governance, a regulation is supposed to ensure that the product is safe. But the wood used in modern construction is no longer a straight piece from a single tree. It is a composite, a bonded assembly of fragments, a product of chemistry as much as forestry. The metaphor fails at the molecular level. The ruler cannot measure what it cannot see. The committee room empties. The lawyer packs his briefcase. The stacks of toxicological reports remain on the gray table, awaiting the next hearing. The drop of condensation has dried, leaving a faint ring on the polished surface, a calcium residue, invisible unless the light catches it at the right angle. The air in the room is still. It smells of paper, toner, and the faintly sweet background that no one mentions because no one has named it. The archive does not close. It does not forgive. It only exhales, slowly, and waits for the next committee, the next recall, the next window opened, just a crack. Too little, too late. The house that kept breathing poison never stopped. It simply learned to breathe quietly. At 2 a.m, the house makes no sound but its own slow chemistry. The furnace cycles once, a deep exhale through the ducts. The refrigerator hums a low E-flat. The air, still and warm, carries something just beneath the threshold of notice, a faint trace, clinical and sweet, like the last molecule of a distillation that finished hours ago. The house is breathing. Not the way a lung breathes, but the way a sealed room breathes, through its walls, its floor, its laminated surfaces, each pressed board and bonded veneer releasing what it has held since the factory press closed. The strange part is not that formaldehyde persists in these spaces. The strange part is that the body already knows the molecule. It makes its own. But that recognition comes later. First, we must visit a room where the chemical's original purpose remains undisturbed, preserved in amber light and silence. Anatomical museums, the ones that still operate, still admit students and scholars, keep their collections in formalin baths. The liquid is clear, faintly yellow in aged glass. Floating inside, a human hand, a section of torso, a brain whose sulci and gyri remain distinct after a century of immersion. The formaldehyde locked the tissue at the moment of death, halted the enzymes that would have turned it to sludge, arrested the bacterial bloom, fixed every cell in a state that resembles suspended animation, but is actually suspended decay. The students who come to study these specimens trace nerve pathways with forceps. They follow the branching of the vagus nerve as it descends through the neck, or examine the delicate architecture of the bronchial tree, air passages preserved as rigid tubes. They are learning the geography of the body from a map that never changes, because the map was drawn with formaldehyde. The molecule does not discriminate. It cross-links proteins indiscriminately, collagen, keratin, hemoglobin, locking them into a stable matrix that will not rot, will not soften, will not forget its shape. It is, in the most literal sense, a preservative of memory. Not the kind of memory that writes itself in words, but the kind that writes itself in flesh. The first anatomical collections using formalin appeared in the 1890s, shortly after August. Wilhelm von Hofmann's production method made the chemical reliable and cheap. Before that, anatomy theaters relied on alcohol, arsenic, or simple refrigeration, methods that worked for weeks, not decades. Formalin made the archive permanent. A specimen prepared in 1898 could sit on a shelf through 2 world wars, through the invention of antibiotics, through the moon landing, through the rise of molecular biology, and still present its structures to a medical student in the year 2025. The dead tissue learns nothing new. It simply waits, held in solution, a piece of evidence from a case closed long ago. But the body that fixes itself in formalin is dead. The body that makes its own formaldehyde is alive. Human metabolism produces formaldehyde as a byproduct of several routine processes: the demethylation of certain amino acids, the oxidation of methanol from dietary sources, the breakdown of choline. It is a fleeting intermediate, present for milliseconds before aldehyde dehydrogenase enzymes convert it to formate, and then to water and carbon dioxide. The concentration inside a living cell is vanishingly small, measured in micromolar units, far below the levels that cause the burning eyes and scratchy throat associated with plywood off-gassing. Yet it is there, a molecule that the body generates, handles, and eliminates every second of every day. This is the threadbare bridge between embalming and life. The same chemical that fixes a corpse in its final posture also flickers through the metabolism of the person reading this sentence. An indigenous ghost, a molecule that is simultaneously self and other. The body does not create formaldehyde as a toxin. It creates it as an intermediate, a necessary step in the transformation of one molecule into another. But if the enzymes that clear it fail, If the liver is damaged, if the exposure from outside overwhelms the detoxification pathway, that indigenous ghost begins to accumulate. Then the line between endogenous and exogenous blurs. The poison the house emits is the same poison the body makes, only in a different dose. The early researchers who first isolated formaldehyde from biological tissues in the 1900s did not know this. They assumed the compound they detected was an artifact of their extraction methods, a contaminant from the glassware. It took decades of careful biochemistry to confirm that living organisms, from bacteria to humans, produce formaldehyde as a normal metabolic trace. The molecule is ubiquitous because life itself generates it. This fact changes the relationship between the chemical and the organism. It is not an invader. It is a native that has been drafted into unnatural service. Consider the domestic interior at 2 in the morning. The walls are painted drywall over plywood sheathing. The furniture is particleboard wrapped in laminate. The carpet is synthetic fiber glued to a foam backing. The air that has been recirculating since the thermostat clicked off contains formaldehyde molecules released from every one of those surfaces. They drift. They enter the nose, the mouth, the moist linings of the respiratory tract. They dissolve into the mucous membrane. They encounter aldehyde dehydrogenase enzymes in the epithelial cells. A fraction is neutralized. The rest passes deeper into the blood, into the liver, into the same metabolic circuits that handle the body's own production. For most people, most of the time, the system copes. The burden is low. The exposure is chronic but subclinical. The effects do not announce themselves as a seizure or a hemorrhage. They register as a slight increase in the rate of cellular turnover, a small but persistent demand on DNA repair mechanisms, a whisper of inflammation in the nasal passages that might be attributed to pollen or dust or the weather. The body absorbs the molecule and keeps its books. The bill does not come due in a single invoice. It accumulates as an incremental risk, distributed across decades, indistinguishable from the background noise of living. The disaster that followed Hurricane Katrina made this slow accumulation visible in a compressed time frame. The FEMA trailers were new. They were built quickly, with maximum particleboard and minimum ventilation. Families moved in and began to experience symptoms within days: burning eyes, nosebleeds, headaches, a metallic taste in the mouth. The indoor formaldehyde concentrations in some units exceeded 0.3 parts per million, more than 3 times the level at which the National Cancer Institute begins to register concern. The trailers were a metabolic stress test that the occupants failed. Their aldehyde dehydrogenase enzymes, efficient though they were, could not keep pace with the constant influx. The body's own production of formaldehyde, normally a non-event, became a baseline against which the added load was measured, and the added load was enormous. In the aftermath, the trailers were condemned, destroyed, or sold at auction to buyers who may or may not have known what the walls were still exhaling. The episode became a case study in regulatory failure, a disaster nested inside a disaster. But the quiet story was not the failure of the government to test the trailers before issuing them. The quiet story was that the trailers were not exceptional. They were extreme examples of a normal condition. Every mobile home, every apartment with pressed wood cabinets, every bedroom with a new desk and closed windows is a FEMA trailer, only slower. The anatomical museum and the suburban bedroom share the same chemistry. The formalin jar and the laminated floorboard both release formaldehyde into the air around them. The difference is intent. The jar is meant to preserve. The floorboard is meant to be walked on. The chemical does not care about the difference. It cross-links proteins in the specimen, and it cross-links proteins in the living nasal epithelium with the same mechanism, the same indifference, the same precise molecular grip. But the living body can repair some of that cross-linking, can excise and replace damaged DNA, can regenerate cells that have been stressed past viability. The dead tissue cannot. This is the crucial asymmetry. The formaldehyde that arrests the specimen in eternal stillness does not arrest the occupant of the house. It merely nudges the occupant's cells toward a slightly higher error rate, a slightly shorter telomere, a slightly earlier senescence. The effect is too small to see in a single person, too diffuse to attribute to one source, but large enough to register in epidemiology, in the statistical contours of cancer registries, in the slow rise of nasopharyngeal carcinoma among workers who spent careers in plywood mills or embalming rooms. And so the house continues to breathe. The walls emit their bonded history. The floorboards release the memory of the resin that was pressed into them under heat and pressure. The air turns over slowly, filtered by the house's own permeability, by the gaps around windows, by the occasional opening of a door. The occupants breathe it in. They are not being preserved. They are being exposed. The chemical does not stop time for them. It simply occupies time, the duration of a lease, the years a child sleeps in a room with laminated furniture, the span of a working life in a sealed office. The archive is not of the dead. It is of the living, slowly annotated by the molecule that preserves everything it touches except life. At 2 in the morning, the amber lamp casts a circle of light on a table. The air is still. The sweet clinical trace is barely there. The listener, lying still in the dark, breathes in and out. The house exhales with each cycle. The archive does not open. It does not close. It simply continues, a slow document written in the only language the chemical knows, the language of binding. The story ends without a door slamming shut. The door was never closed because the archive was built around the living, and the living are still breathing inside it. The truth that became visible in this descent was not simply that formaldehyde is dangerous. It was that the same molecule which holds a dead hand still in its jar also drifts from the walls of a sealed bedroom, from the desk where a child rests her head, from the fogged windows of a FEMA trailer that was supposed to be shelter. The preservative had no loyalty. It kept its promise to the dead and made no promise to the living. The cost could no longer be hidden. The chronic slow exhalation of 100 years of useful chemistry built into the very materials of home. The paradox remains. The substance that stops decay in dead tissue is the same substance that slowly annotates the bodies of the living with cellular damage too small to feel, but large enough to register in epidemiology. The broader implication is this: usefulness does not erase cost. It pushes the cost forward in time, into the bodies of those who never signed the agreement. The house that kept breathing poison was not a failure of technology. It was the normal operation of a technology whose hidden ledger was never balanced. Now the pressure eases from the hull. The darkness above thins to a lighter blue. The hatch opens, and cold sea air fills the lungs. The archive file closes, but the evidence it contains does not vanish. It remains with us, in the walls we trust, in the air we do not see. If this kind of quiet descent into science and history is what you came for, you can subscribe to the Deep Archive. The molecule does not stop. But now, when you notice that faint sweetness in a sealed room, you will know what it is.